You're now listening to Sound Talent Media. Check out more shows at soundtalentmedia.com.
Synth pioneer Gary Numan was overwhelmingly bashed by critics upon his surge to the top of the UK charts in the early 80s. Music writers may not have been ready for Numan's futuristic sound, but fans surely were. By the time he decided to take a hiatus from touring, he was doing multiple nights at Wembley Arena, not to mention opening doors for acts such as the Human League, Depeche Mode, and OMD. This week, we're joined by artist Matt Gondek to dive into all things Numan, especially his new wave classic, Cars.
One hit is all you need to make the money guaranteed, and you can live off royalties forever. And it makes me wonder, is it just a wonder, or is it one hit thunder?
All right, Matt, welcome to the show. You are here today to talk about Gary Numan and his 1979/1980 hit Cars, which, as a visual artist yourself, I think this was a pretty good choice to have you on, because there's more to Gary's whole vibe that it extends beyond just the music itself. So there's some things that I'd like to talk to you about with that. But before we even started recording, you complimented, or I don't know, I guess that was a compliment, my Pittsburgh accent, because even though you've been in LA for 8 years, you are a native of Pittsburgh. You're a Pittsburgh native. Well, at some point you lived in Pittsburgh, right? Because you said you're originally from Central PA somewhere. Is that right?
Yeah, I'm from Central PA. I moved to Pittsburgh proper in the year 2000. I went to a tech school.
Okay.
And I lived there from 2000 until, 8 years ago. I'm terrible with math, but I was in Pittsburgh for a long time.
Right.
Yeah, so close enough. I'm like an hour and a half outside of Pittsburgh.
You get it.
Yeah.
You get the Pittsburgh accent, but you don't necessarily have it because you didn't grow up there. So
totally, I don't have it.
Yeah, you don't have it. You have no accent that I can recognize. Unlike Matt has this weird Philadelphia, what is it? Delco accent.
It's the Delco accent.
It's strange, but yes, a lot of accents on here. So we appreciate you noticing that. And I want to put a little disclaimer on this episode for anyone listening in the UK. We apologize. We know that Gary Numan is not a one-hit wonder in the UK, but he is actually a one-hit wonder here in the United States. And I just think this guy's interesting as hell. I don't know, Matt. I don't know if you just chose Gary Numan because you saw the list of what was available, or if you had a certain affinity for Gary Numan coming into this.
I have a certain affinity for this song. I mean, everybody knows this song, right? But about a year and a half ago, it really started burrowing into my head. And at that point, I kind of did a little bit of a deep dive. And yeah, I did know that he was only a one-hit wonder in the States. He's massive in England. But I just love this song, and I love who he is and how he was in a punk band that transitioned, and how weird he was and who he is now compared to... You go and you watch the Cars music video, and you're like, yeah, that's Gary Numan. But now, like, he would open for Korn, and it's like, he's amazing. And his name, I don't know, I just love him. It's great.
Yeah, it's very interesting story. I really took the deepest dive into Gary Numan over the last couple days. And his story is kind of unlike anyone that we've had on here before. First of all, he's a freaking pioneer of electronic music.
I was going to say, I feel like we've really done like this intro to new wave trifecta over the last month, between jumping from the Buggles into Thomas Dolby into now Gary Numan. Like, we really hit probably the three biggest people of the late 70s, early 80s to like push what the synthesizer and what new wave music would actually be into such a new direction. And I think we did them in almost the exact order that the singles were released to, weirdly.
Yeah, I like it. And this guy is super interesting because, I I actually watched an entire documentary called Resurrection on Gary Numan, which had everybody from Dave Grohl and Trent Reznor. Obviously, Trent Reznor would be influenced by Gary Numan. Lots of electronic music people. And Hans Zimmer was on it. And you really got to see Gary's personality. And one thing I thought was really interesting is from a really young age, at first he did pretty good in school, but then he started doing progressively worse and worse. And then he was diagnosed with Asperger's. They realized he had Asperger's, and he kind of got to a point where he got kicked out of school, and they had him on, whoever his doctor was had him on Valium and something else, which kind of put him, he said it kind of put him in a haze, in a fog. And I thought that was pretty interesting because his delivery, like when you watch the music video for Cars, you see this almost robotic, that was his thing. He's very almost like a robot. And
I saw him described as an androgynous android in the way that he would perform. And I'm like, that's perfect. That's exactly what it is.
That music video, Matt, I don't know if you watched the music video for Cars. Both Matts, I don't know if you watched the music video for Cars. It is almost like a precursor to, it looks like the robot version, the futuristic version of a Chuck E. Cheese band playing the music. It is so robotic, except for the drummer who's kind of animated. But it's a very strange video, and you could see, this is why I was bringing it back around to Matt Gondek, that is, what a big part the visual element played and the futuristic sort of essence to Gary Numan played in his whole thing, in this being a hit. I think the song's great. Don't get me wrong, the song's great, but he definitely had a futuristic look that pushed him to the forefront as well.
Yeah, referencing the Cars video, how I was doing some research myself, and I read that someone wrote that he almost looks like, in the video, he was speaking to someone else and you interrupted him. Because he's just staring at the camera like, who are you? He does that live. Like, there's videos of him playing that song back then live, and all the weird mannerisms and how he kind of will sing a little bit and stare off into space. Like, he did all that live as well.
Right.
Just very, very interesting guy. It was great. Like, it wasn't, and I maybe I'm wrong, but especially what you said about the Asperger's, it wasn't an act. Like, he was just that way. And it was perfect timing for like this futuristic thing. He was into, I'm blanking on the name of the author, but the guy did Blade Runner, the guy that did Total Recall, the actual author. He was really into all that.
Philip K. Dick.
Yes, thank you, Philip K. Dick. So like, he was just like this, he just was this fully formed package of like this futuristic guy with Asperger's that when his music broke out of like this futuristic sound, he was this detached, like humanoid person. And it was the perfect person to deliver this message, I think.
I think you're absolutely right. And being this pioneer and being on the forefront of using synthesizers in your music, he was torn apart by critics. I don't know if you guys knew this, but it was all the UK NME and there were a couple other ones, but just the worst reviews you'll ever see. Dave Grohl talked about that in the documentary. Dave Grohl was basically like, fuck those guys. Like, Gary Numan was a pioneer, and so many people looked down on the synthesizer. A lot of people didn't want to call it an instrument. They called it a machine. But I think that's so silly. I think I just referenced this on another episode recently, but that Björk was talking about how it's what you bring as a human to that instrument that you can express emotion through. It doesn't matter what it is. Like, why is the guitar any better than a synthesizer if you can express your emotion through it and put the human element into it? So people weren't ready for it yet. And Gary Numan, being on such the forefront of it, really received a lot of the brunt of the hit of that later acts like, I don't know, OMD and, everyone that followed.
I was going to say, everyone that followed in his steps started to outsell him. The list that I saw was like Human League, Duran, Depeche Mode, and OMD I feel like is the one that hurts the most because he was the one that found them and brought them as his opening act, and then they blew up so much bigger than him, and then he was the opener for them on shows. I'm sure something that Chris knows nothing about. It's never in the history of Punchline.
What? Never have we taken bands on tour and they not taken us back on tour when they got huge? No, wouldn't know anything about that one. But yeah, it's really, really interesting. And I have the first tangent that I want to get into that I thought I was like, whoa, was so, you know, his debut solo album. Now, the first two albums he released were under the name Tubeway Army, right? Is that what it was called?
Yeah.
Tubeway Army? But they were basically just his albums, but I think he had a band playing with them, but I mean, they were basically Gary Numan albums. But his actual debut solo album, The Pleasure Principle, that Cars is from, which came out in 1979, topped the UK albums chart. But then I was thinking to myself, I'm like, Pleasure Principle? Janet Jackson had a song called Pleasure Principle later on, and I was like, what? Did she like sample Gary Numan in that, or was she a Gary Numan fan or something? So I looked into it, and yes, Pleasure Principle, great Janet Jackson song. Anyone who listens to this show knows I'm a big Janet head. Love Janet. It's on her Control album. I have that on vinyl. It came out in 1986, and actually, the Pleasure Principle. Let me start by saying this. Either Matt, do you guys know what the Pleasure Principle is?
No.
Okay. So I hadn't heard that term before, but it's actually in Freudian psychoanalysis, it's the instinctive seeking of pleasure and avoiding pain to satisfy biological and psychological needs. So when you're a little kid or when you're a baby, you are purely on the pleasure principle. I want to eat. I want to, I need a drink. I need to eat. You only want pleasure. And even if you're a kid, you're bored. I want something to do. I want pleasure. Whereas when you get older, the contrast to the pleasure principle, the counterpart to it, is the concept of the reality principle, which describes the capacity to deter gratification of a desire when circumstantial reality disallows the immediate gratification of it. I mean, that's just a fancy way to say, like, you grow up and you realize you can't have everything you want the second you want it. And I started thinking about that a lot. And I read deeper into it and said, like, maturity is learning to endure the pain of deferred gratification. That's just what being a human, what growing up is. Freud argued that an ego thus educated has become reasonable. It no longer lets itself be governed by the pleasure principle, but obeys the reality principle, which also at bottom seeks to obtain pleasure, but pleasure which is, through taking account of reality, even though pleasure is postponed and diminished. Whatever. Once again, fancy words for a real common sense sort of thing. But I was thinking to myself, man, think about if you were super rich, if you were a billionaire or something, do you just live your life in a constant state of pleasure principle? And then at some point, I mean, it probably has to happen so fast. The pleasure you don't get the pleasure from those things anymore because you just have them all the time, right?
There was a quote that I remember hearing years ago on an episode of Geekscape, actually. It was Jonathan was talking to Scott from Real Big Fish. And he was like, look, when you give a kid what feels like a bottomless pit of money, like after you've bought every video game system you've ever wanted and like all the rare comic books you wanted, and it still feels like there's more money than you know what to do with. He's like, you just start getting dangerous. And I think that's like that same kind of idea of like, you just, I guess, the family from Succession, whatever they want, they can just go and do it. But like eventually there has to be a burnout at a certain point.
That's a good comparison because if you're a billionaire, you could have anything you want, but on that show, that's what they're illustrating, that they just want the company. They just want the power, whatever it takes to get that. And I just thought that was really a side tangent. It's just that Gary Numan's album is called The Pleasure Principle. And Matt, that's a pretty good comparison to the Real Big Fish thing, because Gary Numan, when he blew up this huge, he was 21 years old. So he hasn't really struggled. He recorded his first 3 albums like within like a year. He made like 3 albums in the first year. And on the 3rd album, he has this hit Cars and a bunch of hits in the UK. And he's playing Wembley.
He decides to retire touring for what I think was a couple weeks ultimately, but like
that's well, what's crazy about that is that was the main theme of the documentary, was that he reached that level at such a young age so quickly that then he spent his whole life trying to get back there.
Is it dark?
Like the documentary, like where
him
it goes?
trying to climb back up. Is that like a dark point in his life?
Yeah, he it definitely gets dark. And I guess Matt Gondek, let me ask you this. Would you take having massive success at a young age and then feeling like you could never get back there? Or would you rather constantly be on a upward trajectory, even if it's minimal things at a time?
Minimal trajectory for sure.
Yeah.
I mean, like, imagine having everything, you know, when you're 20, and then what else are you going to do with your life other than chase it again? Like, It's the same thing with drug addicts. You chase something, the first time you do drugs, you feel a certain way, you'll never get back there, and you're always just chasing the same sensation, but you'll never get it again. I'm sure it's kind of the same thing.
Right. Yeah.
I'd rather have the long upward trajectory, I think.
Yeah. I mean, when I hear stories like Gary Numan's, you know, it makes me think, you know, about my own life trajectory or whatever. It's easy to get bummed. You compare yourself to people around you and whatever. But as long as you are still, you know, driving towards something and making progress on that feels good when you reach those levels and it makes sense and you've paid your dues. Whereas, you know, this Gary Numan thing, I mean, it's unfortunate for him, and we'll get to, like, I think he's a pioneer, he's a talented artist, but it came fast for him.
But I think, so let's say the reverse of that though, right? Like, I agree with you that it's like, man, when you're 20 and you've peaked and it's 1980, like that sucks. Like that sucks hard. And especially like you said, the critics are just like not even getting what you're doing. They not only just don't get it, they are actively writing articles about how awful it is what you're doing. But then, you know, you have this weird redemption when you get into like the early 90s where industrial starts to explode. Right. And all of these artists who are like the biggest artists in music are citing you specifically as like the guy. Well, like, did you look at the lineup on the tribute album that they put out?
Well, dude, the crazy part about that is, if you guys, I'm assuming, obviously, you guys have probably both seen Walk Hard, you know, the Dewey Cox story.
Yeah.
So good. Yeah. But, you know, he goes through that whole thing where he's trying all these different types of music. He gets to the point where he's kind of like, I guess they're kind of making fun of Brian Wilson, where he's in the studio and he has all the weird instruments and everything, and he just goes down this crazy path. Well, Gary Numan kind of did that. Throughout the whole 80s, after his peak, every album was selling less and less, and he was getting more and more avant-garde. He was just... and by his own admission, every album was getting worse and worse until 1992. He released this album called Machine and Soul. And the cover of it, so keep in mind, it's 1992. It doesn't look like Gary Numan. It looks like a cheesy 90s like pop guy on the cover of it. And that's when he said he completely lost himself. He was at his lowest. He said that's his worst album. And that is when he met his wife, Gemma, who had been a fan of him forever. She met him at his lowest point, and she introduced him to industrial music, which he was not familiar with. And so now you have bands like Nine Inch Nails, Trent Reznor, a huge influence on him was Gary Numan. And, you know, Gary Numan didn't even know Nine Inch Nails. And now Gary Numan is influenced by Nine Inch Nails. You know, it's crazy how that went full circle. And then, you know, you see in the documentary, they even like play shows together. He comes out on stage during Nine Inch Nails. But it was at that moment that, like you were saying, Matt Gondek, that, you know, that he became, you know, I don't know if it's new metal, but it's definitely like...
He sounds to me like Nine Inch Nails light. And I want to preface that by saying Nine Inch Nails is my favorite band. Yeah. And anyone listening, a little treat, you go on YouTube, it's Nine Inch Nails 2009 tour. Gary Numan comes out, they do a car cover. And it's him and Trent, and it's incredible. It's so fucking good. Right. But yeah, he sounds like... Gary Numan now sounds like Nine Inch Nails light to me, which is great. I love it.
Yeah, it's cool. I listened to a lot of it, and it's definitely way different than the early 80s.
Did you watch any of the live performances of him now, like say 2023? Like you watch, if you watch the Cars video, then you immediately watch a Gary Numan live from 2023. First of all, this guy, he's like 68, 67 at this point. He looks like an extra from the movie Mad Max now. Like that's his whole thing.
Yeah.
And he has a band now that like, it's these two bald dudes. Like they look like they're in Mudvayne or something. It's crazy.
Yeah.
He took such a hard like left turn in his career, but I think what helped him keep going.
91 Donkey Lane is a magical apartment complex that contains immense power but lacks intelligent inhabitants.
What is happening?
I'm getting texts.
Why are we getting a lot of texts?
People found out what we did.
Oh, dividing Mike Myers into an infinite amount of tiny Mike Myers?
Listen to 91 Donkey Lane for free on Spotify or your favorite podcasting app. More at 91donkeylane.com. See you there, you donkeys.
I'm going to age myself because the first time I even heard the song Cars wasn't by Gary Numan. It was the Fear Factory cover.
Oh, that's such a good cover. We listened to it yesterday. We were doing like all the different covers and oh my God, it's so good.
Frank Zappa covered some of his songs. Like the influences are insane. And that's like Chris, I want to just run down real quick a few of the artists that showed up. In 1997, they put out a Gary Numan tribute album and it featured covers from Gravity Kills. Totally makes sense that Gravity Kills would be into Gary Numan. EMF, who we've talked about on this show before. Jesus Jones, who I'm sure we'll get to one of these days.
Yeah.
The Magnetic Fields.
Okay.
Republica, who we'll definitely talk about one day on here. But the one that blew me away was the lead singer of Blur and Matt Sharp from Weezer collaborated together on a song for that album as well, which is like two of my like 90s worlds just like colliding into to each other.
Well, you know, a lot of those people, I mean, think about, you said Matt Sharp, think about Weezer and how they used the Moog, you know? And
well, even 97, we're at the start of the Rentals.
Right.
You know what I mean? Like the Rentals was all
so
Moog.
Gary Numan influenced. Right. Are you kidding? And Matt asked about, have I seen a recent performance? I saw a performance from the day we're recording this 3 days ago. He played at Cruel World Festival
here in LA.
Yeah. With Susie and the Banshees played, right? And it was the one that got rained out or something the first day. But they had
to shut it down. Isn't that crazy?
Yeah, I watched him play.
It's amazing.
Yeah.
Can I also point out something?
Great.
I'm sorry, go ahead.
No, sorry. He looks like you were saying. I think he looks great. He doesn't look like an older guy. I mean, he has some funny like face makeup on, and he kind of does look pretty new metalish, pretty industrial. But you know, he's doing his thing and doing well. I saw that even some of his newer albums charted well in the UK and stuff.
Yeah, he has a new album out that did really well. It's like a new single. Oh my, I think it's called it might be called Insider. I can't remember off the top of my head, but it's doing really well. I also want to point out one other thing and ask you if this was pointed out in the documentary. You know, back when he first came out with Cars and everything, even though the critics panned him, from everything I've heard, if you were just a kid at that time, the first time, a lot of these people that I'm like researching Gary about all this stuff, the first time they heard Cars, it was like literally they never heard anything like that before.
Yeah.
And how many times in your life have you seen or heard something that you're like, this is completely new to me?
Right.
And a lot of the people that like were kids at the time were like, that's what Cars was to them. Like there were electronic bands at that time, but they were kind of obscure. Gary was the first guy that kind of used those instruments to make pop music, and like it was more mainstream. So like the average person for the first time ever heard computer music, and it blew everybody's mind. And whether or not it was good or bad, like if you listen to that album now, Pleasure Principle, it's super tame and kind of basic, but you have to look at it through the lens of like never ever even knowing you can make music with computers. It's incredible.
Right.
Yeah. Well, and Chris, I'm sure if you stumbled upon this factoid, I'm sure you love to hear it, that you know, most people maybe write a song using a piano or using a guitar, but he's gone on the record to say, nope, he wrote this song with just a bass in his hands.
Love that.
And built the song around the bass.
Yeah.
He actually had said that he wrote this with the intentions of it being a pop song. He actually thinks it's a very mediocre, average song in the grand scheme of things. But he said, like, this was the first time I'd ever written a song with the intention of maybe I can write a hit single.
Well, I think that Matt's point about it, people hadn't heard this before. When you said that, Matt, I was thinking, has there been anything in my life where I've been like, what is this? I haven't heard this before. The iPhone?
For me, it was iPhone and the Nintendo 64 were the two things in my life. I was like, what are these things? That's
right. Well, if we're going beyond music, I'll never forget the first time I saw a Sega Genesis. Went to a friend's birthday party, and his parents had a big screen TV, and he had got a Sega Genesis, and I saw Sonic the Hedgehog for the first time, and I was like, what is that? That is crazy. Yeah. That's so... But music-wise, I think the closest thing that I could think of to it where I'm like, I haven't heard this before, would probably be in the 90s when I first heard ska music, when I first heard Operation Ivy, when I first heard, Less Than Jake or Real Big Fish or whoever. Like, I was like, what is this? I haven't heard this before.
I think for me, musically, it would be hearing The Streets for the first time.
Oh, yeah.
I was like, what even is this? And then if we can go outside of music, it would be my cousin and I were spending the night at my grandfather's house, and he had HBO, and they were playing a movie called Freaked. And I remember we watched that movie, and it shattered my brain. If the people who've seen Freaked know exactly what I'm talking about. For the people who haven't, it is a film written, directed, and starring Alex Winter, Bill from the Bill and Ted movies.
Okay.
And it is just... It was written to be a Butthole Surfers movie originally, and it's just about a guy who goes and ends up being mutated into a freak for a freak show ran by Randy Quaid, and it's like Mr. T plays the bearded lady in it, like Keanu Reeves plays Ortiz the dog boy. Like, it is the most off-the-wall shit you'll ever see, but it's Screaming Mad George doing everything. And, like, Screaming Mad George is... arguably one of the most underrated like special effects guys. Like, everyone thinks of Tom Savini, but like Screaming Mad George is the guy who did shit like Freddy Krueger turning a woman into a cockroach. Like, he's that dude who can just make the most surrealistic shit happen practically in a movie. So watching a 90-minute movie where every single second is the most bizarre practical effects I've ever witnessed in my life. I remember being like 10, being like, I will never see another thing that breaks my brain the way that this visual aesthetic has broken my brain right now.
I've never even heard of
that movie.
Oh my God, see it. Check it out.
Is it on Tubi?
It might be on Tubi.
Okay.
It might be on Tubi.
Everything's on Tubi. As far as taking it back to Gary Numan here, did you guys listen to his other hit from that era, Our Friends Electric?
So good.
It's
really good.
So weird though.
Did you look into the lyrics of what it's about? It's about like replicants, like robots, like the people in our lives are robots and they're coming to help us and like for everything. It's great.
Yeah.
Right. But
it's weird.
I mean, it even to throw it back to Philip K. Dick, I mean, the original title of Blade Runner was Do Androids Dream of Electric Sheep? Like, the name just feels like part of that Phil K. Dick aesthetic anyway.
Well, I just meant as far as that was a #1 song for multiple weeks in the UK. It is such... Look, I think it's cool, and it's weird as hell. There are parts that are like spoken word in it. It's really kind of hard to follow the melody. It sounds futuristic and weird, but a #1 hit. Like, we're talking like...
Well, think about it. Wasn't David Bowie huge at that point?
Yeah.
I mean, like, you get the Bowie-ness from him, but then, like, I'm sure people were kind of burnt out with Bowie at that point, and they're looking for the next thing, and I think that song is a nice transition into what's new, but I also like David Bowie.
Right.
Like, it's weird, and there are the spoken parts. Did you know David Bowie felt threatened by Gary Numan when he came out?
Really?
I believe it.
David Bowie thought that Gary Numan was like copying him, which if you think of that and then like you go back and listen and you look at Gary Numan, especially the Cars video, for example, like it's kind of glam and it's kind of androgynous and kind of weird. I completely could see why Bowie thought that like Gary was ripping him off.
Yeah, I didn't think of the Bowie comparison at all, but it makes a lot of sense now that you say that. His whole thing, his whole look, for sure, even if the music was a little bit different. And hey, something else that I thought about when I was researching this, during his sort of, whatever you want to call it, downhill after the big hits throughout that whole decade, at some point he collaborated on an album with Roger from Queen, was on one of his albums.
I think it was his second or his third album. the musicians on it were Roger Taylor from Queen and Mick and Rob from the band Models were like his backup band.
I thought that was crazy because wasn't it just a few years earlier that Queen was talking shit on synths? Didn't we talk about that recently? Where we were like, why would Queen talk shit on synthesizers? Didn't later, wasn't that like a big part of some like Freddie Mercury stuff later on? I think maybe they probably would have taken that back. I remember maybe it was on the Buggles episode we talked about that. Anyway, I thought that was interesting. But Matt, I didn't look this up, but what was going on in the charts at the time?
This is a weird charts. Usually I know the songs.
Okay.
I did not know a lot of these songs. Now, I'm on the younger end. I was an 85 baby. This was 5 years before I existed. But this song peaked at number 9 on June 7th, 1980. The number 1 song we all know, it was Lips Incorporated's Funky Town.
Okay.
So we still are in the disco era a little bit there.
Yeah.
The rest of the top 10, Elton John was at number 10 with Little Janine.
Okay.
I don't know that one.
Yeah, I kind of don't either. I think maybe I've heard the name of that song.
Number 8 was Linda Ronstadt with Hurt So Bad.
Okay.
Number 7 was Bob Seger, Against the Wind.
Oh, yeah, of course.
Now, here's the ones I definitely know. Number 6 was Bette Midler's The Rose.
Okay.
Lovely ballad. Number 5 was Blondie's Call Me.
Yeah, that song was number 1 on the day I was born. That was my number 1.
Number 4 was Kenny Rogers featuring Kim Carnes with Don't Fall in Love with a Dream.
Okay.
Number 3 was Ambrosia with The Biggest Part of Me.
Oh, that's a good one. You know that one?
I don't.
I have no idea what that is.
Oh, Ambrosia. Look, Ambrosia has that How Much I Feel. How much I feel for you, baby. You know that one? How much I do. It's just an amazing song. You got to listen to How Much I Feel sometime because it's like this really pretty chorus, but all the verses are about this guy's in a relationship, or I think he's married, and he's having dreams about some other woman. And it's just dreams about cheating on his wife. And then it was how much I feel. And it's like, you're supposed to sympathize with him, I guess, but it's just part of that whole yacht rock thing that like, where it's problems for guys probably dressed all in white on a boat in 1980 or something, like very specific problems, but anyway.
Gotcha. And then the number 2 hit was Paul McCartney and Wings with Coming Up Live.
Okay. All
Coming
right.
Up, the live version.
It is a strange top 10 because it's not
that
a
is
lot
a
of
really wild top 10 for sure.
Yeah.
So can we talk about the construction of the song Cars? Because this was something I never thought about until I was listening to it and reading about it. So I'm going to pull this directly from the wiki. It says Cars is based on 2 musical sections, a verse, then an instrumental break to the bridge. The recording features the conventional rock rhythm section of bass and drums, but the rest of the instruments are completely synthesizers. The bridge section also includes a tambourine part. The song becomes an instrumental from the 1 minute and 30-second point until its conclusion.
Oh,
which
yeah.
I never thought about that, but it does. The verses are just done after a minute and a half of the song, and the rest is just an instrumental synth piece.
Could you imagine playing that song live and he just has to kind of stand there? If you watch the video, he really goes off on that tambourine because he has nothing else to do. There's no car in the music video for Cars, by the way, but
Right.
It's all tambourine. There's so much of him holding the tambourine, then the tambourine spinning around, and he's in the tambourine for a while. Because what else does he have to do? Like, could you imagine having to play that live? It's probably terrible for him.
Yeah,
it's so funny you brought up that part in the music video is that, yes, it's a tambourine where he's on a green screen and he is in the middle of a tambourine playing a tambourine.
It's amazing.
And it is amazing. And that, dude, this is, okay, it only hit number 9 in the United States, but it's a number 1 song. Let's stress that. A number 1 song in the UK where it's a complete instrumental after a minute and a half into the song.
Yeah.
That is crazy. That is wild. And I think it's part of, on that documentary, once again, I'll bring it back to that. He talks about how he has a real hang up about like being called retro, and he won't do any of those like retro shows. Like this thing he just played at Cruel World. I don't think it was marketed like that. It was marketed.
No, it was some new bands as well.
Right. but he won't do one of those like, oh, it's all these one-hit wonders from the 80s. He won't do that. He said he hates nostalgia, and he said like he said I wrote Cars 5 lifetimes ago. Who gives a fuck? That's what he said on the thing. And his wife is like, but you got to realize that like that's, you know, it's not your whole career, but it is part of it. He's like, I don't care about that song. So I think you got to kind of have a middle ground on that. Yes, I wouldn't want to just be known for the one song and that's it. But at the same time, like, you got to own the song that the most people know too. I think there's a fine line there of, you know, making the people happy and also being happy yourself, you know?
Totally. There was a long point while he was playing live for years and years, he wouldn't play the song at all. And it was only, I think in the last 10 years, it kind of came back. He's like, he kind of realized what that did for him. And he went full circle with it. And he plays it now, but for a long time, he kind of just let it alone. It's kind of like Creep by Radiohead. They don't play that either. I don't think.
Did he do like his him now version of it? Because his voice is even different now.
It's all metaled out now. If you watch like any of the live videos, his even like the whole album Pleasure Principle, if he plays any of those songs, it's very metal now. Right. So he updated a lot of his old stuff.
It's like when Vanilla Ice came back and did the new metal version of Ice Ice Baby.
Yeah.
But hey man, this guy seemed to influence a lot of people that I really love. I mean, you said Nine Inch Nails are your favorite band. Growing up, I don't know if they're my favorite band ever now, but they were I brought this up recently when we had Allie on the show. I had like 30 Nine Inch Nails t-shirts when I was in high school. They were my favorite band, and I guess I kind of just lost touch maybe one album after the Downward Spiral or something, but I definitely think that, you know, one of the most prolific artists of our time, Trent Reznor, was heavily influenced by Gary Numan, as apparently were a lot of other people. And, you know, when it comes to, we're going to have to make that thunder or blunder decision here. It would be hard to go blunder on Gary Numan. I don't know. Either you guys going to go blunder on this guy?
Nah.
No.
Iconic,
so.
dude. He's iconic.
Yeah, it's kind of hard to do that. And I think there's a lot of 80s artists that owe their career to what, you know, Gary Numan broke open the door towards, like we referenced earlier, Human League, OMD. I mean, everybody. It's kind of like everybody in the early to mid 80s in the world of pop, whether they were directly influenced or just, you know, had the door open for them. You know, Gary Numan was right there at the forefront of it.
Yeah, and I think the other thing that's worth mentioning is, like, you know, this song is after Video Killed the Radio Star, which we had already talked about. But I think the other big difference is, like, where we talked about, you know, She Blinded Me with Science and Video Killed the Radio Star, which She Blinded Me with Science was after Cars. But, like, Video Killed the Radio Star is such a poppy song. This I feel like really showed how dark you could get with the synths. Like, even it just being a weird song where he's talking about cars and it's written with the intentions of it being a pop single, like, it doesn't shock me that a band like Fear Factory would cover this, because it sounds, that bass line is sinister sounding. Like, it is a very dark tone. I think that maybe that's also why people turned on it. It's one thing when you're using the synth for, like, happy songs, but to, like, kind of go to the bassiest part of it.
Hey,
no one had done that yet. You know what I mean?
You know,
like,
I'm glad you said that, Matt, because I would have forgot to drop this little fact I learned from the documentary, which I thought was one of the weirdest things that I had heard. So apparently, when Gary was growing up, he lived near an airport, and the planes would fly overhead, and he loved watching them fly overhead and hearing them go. And he talked about how the sound, the deep bass sound of the plane flying overhead, that really resonated with him, and that's what made him love the sounds on these newly discovered synths. How weird is that?
That's a little weird.
Yeah.
Can I tack on something to that?
Sure.
So Gary, you know, he didn't even realize, like, these Moog keyboards and everything existed. He was just in a recording studio, And I guess how it goes is he was in the recording studio to record some music, and someone was there before him recording and just left one of these keyboards, and he didn't even know what it was. And he literally just pushed a button on it, and the noise it made was this deep, loud, like deep sound. And that's what sparked this idea in his head to make music. And he says, how lucky was it that he randomly hit a button and whoever was there before him had this thing programmed to go deep? Because if it was like a high-pitched noise, he probably would have been like, yeah, this is stupid, and just like kept going.
Wow.
Like completely random. Like
wow.
I think that's probably another reason the critics hated him in the beginning, because like you said earlier, Matt, like he wrote Cars on a bass. He literally said that he opened the case of the bass. It was the first thing he ever played. It was like, I wrote that song in like an hour. So like he admitted that like, this is easy for me, or not easy for him, but dumb. So he kind of took the piss out of himself from the beginning. And I think that's why a lot of the critics didn't like it in the beginning.
It makes me think about, and I mean, we could debate this forever, but like, you know, being a kid who was growing up in the TRL days, right? And it's like, back then I listened to my new metal and my punk and my ska. So like anything that had the word pop associated with it was like, oh, that's cheap. That's, you know, like NSYNC's garbage. That's just manufactured pop music. Now I can look back at it and be like, man, the production on this and the songwriting on this is incredible. And I feel like that is just, you know, history repeats itself. In the world of pop music, it is like at the time that it's the number one thing somewhere, when it's topping the charts, critics and you know, naysayers alike are like, this is trash. People are going to forget about this. So you're already seeing it happen with like, you know, 10 years ago mumble rap, and now like you look back at some of those songs and go, actually, these songs were pretty tight. Like, these songs were pretty good. Like, I feel like it's just human instinct to hate something that works, that's slightly different and puts you out of your comfort zone, and then years later it gets reevaluated, and
I think
notice is important.
I've noticed in my own life, and I don't know if you guys noticed this, but that I think great art, a lot of times I will dislike it at first, and then it grows on me and becomes some of my favorite ever. You brought him up earlier, Matt, The Streets. The first time I heard The Streets, I was like, oh my God, I hate this. What, a couple years later, oh, Mike Skinner is one of my favorite artists of all time, you know? And I felt that way about a lot of my favorite artists. It's just, maybe I'm not ready for it, or there's something deeper in it that you have to, repeated listens are necessary to get further into it, whereas something that's sugary and catches your attention and you like it right off the bat might lose its appeal real quick. And I don't think I'm the only one who's ever experienced something like that. You know, I think
well, talking about stuff that doesn't lose its appeal real quick, Matt, tell us about all the stuff that you've been working on and where people can go check it out.
Wow, what a transition.
Yeah, that was a crazy segue. I want to say, first of all, for anyone listening, please, Matt Gondek, GONDEK.com. You got to go look at Matt. I've known your, this is what I want to tell. I've known your art before I knew your name. So
same to you. I mean, I grew up knowing of your band, and I had Play, and yeah, this is funny to like look at you in the face and talk to you. But yeah, cool, man. We're both from Pittsburgh. Yeah. About 100 years ago, I was at a party, and Punchline's drummer took the girl I was with away from me, and I'm very upset about it.
What?
I don't even know his name, dude. I just remember it's like, oh, that's the Punchline drummer. I'm like, oh well, F that guy. Oh. I don't even know the dude. I don't even know. It was like I was like fucking 12 years old. It's totally fine.
Yeah. I mean, probably PJ. Oh, PJ, what are you doing?
Yeah, you know, Erica got away from me. It's totally fine. It's just, but that's what I associate you in my head because I don't know you. But yeah, dude. Thank you. I'm an artist. I moved away from Pittsburgh. I live in LA. I'm a fine artist. A lot of gallery shows all over the world. I do a podcast. It's called Clean Break. It's a podcast about art and business. So, you know, growing up, I didn't know how to make art or I didn't know how to sell art and make money from it. But fortunately, just through time and experience, I learned. So we do a podcast where I interview some of the top artists on earth and ask them how they made it and try to break it down and share with young artists so they can make it too. It's called cleanbreakpodcast.com. And then I also paint.
Dude, your art is incredible. By the way, I mean, I'm not just saying that because you're our guest today. What I've been, so you are considered a deconstructive pop artist, correct?
Yes.
Which for people that are listening that aren't currently on your website to look at and understand what that means. What does that mean?
Okay, yeah. So layman's terms, deconstructive pop artist. What is pop art? Pop art is what's current, right? So think of like a cartoon you like Mickey Mouse or Bart Simpson. I deconstruct those things. So my paintings are, of characters blowing up or decomposing and pulled apart. Not in a gory way, but they're just falling apart.
Right.
I have a whole rabbit hole about the art behind it and the meaning behind it, but like that's the layman term for people. But it's very bright, very bold artwork, a lot of like thick black outlines and just very attention grabbing.
Yeah, dude, I was also really impressed. I wish I would have been able to go there and see it, but your Fight Club exhibit at the Warhol Museum in Pittsburgh, when saw so 300 spiked baseball bats, correct?
Yeah, that actually was in New York. I did a project. Yeah, the Fight Club was 300 spiked baseball bats. We handmade them. They're all different colors. The spiked baseball bat's like a metaphor for my work. I grew up in like a lot of punk rock bands and loving that stuff. And you look at a spiked baseball bat and you kind of get that vibe. And then with the neon colors I use, I painted every bat with those. So it just kind of sets a precedent for what I'm into. I did a project with the Warhol last year. I was like part of their advertising campaign. So I was on a bunch of billboards in the city, which is great because I got to come home and like hang out with Rick and the Warhol team and finally just like kind of get my foot in the door there, because I've been wanting to work with them in some capacity since I left, and that was kind of my first foray with them.
It's probably the absolute coolest possible thing you can do if you're in Pittsburgh, is to be, work with, be associated with the Warhol Museum. So
yeah, dude. I mean, obviously I'm a huge fan of Warhol and everything that he did, and it was just an honor to do that. I mean, I've been dreaming about that particular project since I was like a kid, so it was really cool.
It's really, really awesome. I saw that your paintings and sculptures have been featured in exhibitions everywhere from, LA, New York, Paris, Bangkok, Hong Kong, Korea, Singapore. Dude, that is so badass. That is so freaking cool.
Thanks, man. Appreciate it. Yeah, thank you.
Love to see a Pittsburgher thriving out in the world. Hey, I know you're in LA, but you're still a Pittsburgher, man. As far as I'm concerned.
I still feel it. No, I am. I'm very East Coast.
We're claiming you.
That's fine. I'm happy about that. I'll stick Pittsburgh.
Hell yeah, man. Well, hey, we all said thunder on Gary Numan, and thanks so much for coming on today, man.
Yeah, thanks for having me, guys. I appreciate it.
Hi there, I'd like to return myself. This one's defective, was there on the shelf. I tried it, I liked it, but it must be bad timing, 'cause now I don't think that it's boding well. But back to
This has been One Hit Thunder. One Hit Thunder is hosted by Chris Fafalios of the bands Punchline Pack and Another Cheetah, and produced by Matt Kelly of Geekscape.net. Underneath me, you're hearing Dead When It Hits the Shelves off the Punchline album Lion. Be sure to check out punchline.com for any upcoming news with the band. Our podcast is on Patreon now, so find us at patreon.com/OHT podcast for early access to the episodes, bonus chats, and a chance to vote on future songs. Be sure to rate, review, and subscribe on any podcasting app, and tune in next week for more One Hit Thunder.
see this thing is falling apart. Is this how you made it? Or I desecrated something that was created in the stars? I wanna be a realist, but is that the realist? Yeah, I'm here still holding, keeping cool like strolling. Look closely, I'm rolling off a cliff. Dead when I hit the shelves. I'm dead when I hit the shelves. Dead when it hits to the go-get. Dead when it hits the shelves. I'm dead when I hit the shelves. I'm dead when I hit the shelves.
You're listening to the Geekscape Network.
Hi, this is Krista Makes, host of Krista Makes a Podcast. The theme of the podcast is songwriting. Each week, my musical guest picks a defining song from their career to discuss, critique, and analyze during the show. So please join me for some fun and insight into some of the greatest songs ever written and recorded. Listen and subscribe at soundtalentmedia.com.
What's up, everybody? I am Finn McKenty, host of the Punk Rock NBA podcast, part of the Sound Talent Media Podcast Network. My podcast is all about doing what you love for a living, and every week I sit down and talk to people who have done exactly that. For example, musicians like Tommy from Between the Buried and Me, Matt from Periphery, Lil Lotus and Shinigami, among many others, photographers, artists, designers, YouTubers like Glenn Fricker and Sarah Dici, and I unpack exactly how they got to where they are today with the goal of helping you do the same. So if that sounds cool, you can listen and subscribe at soundtalentmedia.com, and I'll see you there.